Hey friends, this is Aaron Summers, and welcome to the Church Brain Podcast. Each week, we help churches think clearly through stress and transition. And this week, we're going to talk about why churches repeat the same unhealthy patterns. Now, it's not because churches want unhealthy outcomes. It's not because every pastor is the wrong pastor. But it's because churches under stress often stop thinking clearly about what's actually happening. Now, I call that the church brain, and we're going to get into that in just a few minutes. And when that happens, churches tend to repeat what they never stopped long enough to understand. Now, here's the clear statement I want you to have today. Churches rarely repeat mistakes because they lack good intention. They repeat mistakes because unresolved patterns remain underneath the surface while everyone focuses only on the latest personality or conflict. Let me say something carefully here. Sometimes pastors really do make poor decisions. I've made a ton of them myself. It wasn't just because I was young and dumb. I did it later too. We make poor decisions sometimes. And sometimes church leadership is genuinely unhealthy. But healthy churches, or at least those that want to be healthy, still need to ask some deeper questions. Like, what patterns existed before the pastor arrived? What expectations did we have that were unclear? What systems helped create or continue the tension that we felt? Because if every difficult season is simply reduced to, well, the last pastor was the problem, then your church learns nothing. You see, the church brain under stress is a real thing. And that's one of the things that I talk about often is the church brain. Churches think, feel, behave collectively. And just like individuals under stress can become foggy and reactive, churches can do this as well. Under stress, churches will often simplify problems too quickly. They personalize conflict, or they shorten their patience. They react emotionally, or they rush to decisions, or they simply look for whatever's the most immediate relief. And one of the easiest ways to simplify pain is to attach it to another person. We call that scapegoating. This is why churches will do that instead of examining patterns. Because if the problem's only the pastor, well, then the church doesn't have to wrestle with deeper questions about culture and expectations, communication, or systems. But unresolved patterns don't disappear just because leadership changes. In fact, they usually return in a different and worse form later. So here's a few things to consider. First of all, stop asking what happened. Most churches process difficult seasons simply by asking, well, what happened with the last pastor? Now, that question is important, but it's also incomplete. You see, healthy churches are going to ask a few different questions. Here's 4 questions. What patterns kept surfacing? What tensions repeated themselves? What expectations remained unclear? And what conflicts existed before the last pastor arrived? Because churches rarely suffer from a single, isolated event. More often, they repeat unresolved patterns through different people and different seasons. Here's another thing. Separate the pastor from the pattern. Now, this is one of the healthiest exercises a church can do after a difficult season. Ask these questions. What belonged to the pastor? I mean, look at the pastor, the patterns. What were his? That's fair, and that's okay to ask. But the next one is what belonged to the church? This gets to the what existed before he got here moment. Were there unhealthy things before the pastor arrived? What patterns existed before this pastor arrived? You see, what happens sometimes is we blame the pastor for something that's been going on over and over and over again. I remember a church that I served, and it was getting a little bumpy after a few years there. And I had a director of missions call me up one day and say, well, you're not the first one that's dealt with that. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, are you dealing with this and this and that? And I said, yes. He said, so did the last three pastors. It's not new with you. Now, that doesn't necessarily make it easier to deal with, but it does help understand that there's an underlying pattern that the church must deal with. And then another question is, what patterns are going to continue if nothing changes? I mean, are we really satisfied with changing pastors every 2 years? I don't think so. That's not healthy. It's not healthy for your pastors and their families. It's not healthy for your church family. But we see it happen because we don't actually deal with the stuff we need to deal with in the interim. We rush into doing things, and we'll get to that in a second. You see, the conversation of this magnitude changes everything, because now the church is not just assigning blame to an individual. Now the church is learning what's going on, and healthy churches learn before they move forward. So that leads me to the slow it down moment. I tell you this all the time. I've said it on several episodes. We've got to slow down before rushing to the next chapter. Now, we hate unresolved discomfort and conflict, so we just want to get over that. We don't like having the vacancy in the pulpit, so we're going to move as quickly as we can and find the next pastor. We want a pastor 3 weeks after the last one left, and that's not healthy for you, and really it's not reality either. You see, after a hard season, there's an enormous temptation to move quickly toward the next thing, the next pastor, the next vision, the next excitement. But rushing forward without reflection usually guarantees repeated patterns. Sometimes they talk about having a debriefing or having an evaluation moment. It's the same kind of thing. In interim ministry, we often will use an event called the heritage event or history event to help work through and identify a few things. In the simplest form, you get the church together and they, on a timeline, on a big wall, they put sticky notes of all the best things that have happened over the years in the church. And then they put sticky notes on the wall of all the worst things that have happened at the church. And then you just talk about it. You talk about how you can praise God through all of the ways that we have seen him bless us as a church. But then we can pray to God and remember that even through the difficult times, God was still present. And sometimes we see, well, that was a difficulty in that decade and in this decade and that decade. Or we can put a third color sticky note and put when each new pastor started, and that'll really start a discussion. Well, why? I didn't realize we've had 5 pastors in 12 years. You have. You just keep losing everybody and new people come in, and that's, again, a problem. You see, what this does is it creates intentional space for churches to remember honestly what's happened, to celebrate the good things, grieve over the bad things, and learn clearly where you are, where you've been, and make good decisions before rushing into the future. What patterns do we need to break? What habits do we have or expectations that we're placing on pastors? What patterns and systems need to change in order to accommodate a long-tenured pastor? Because reflection's not about staying stuck in the past. It's about refusing to waste the lessons of the past. One of the reasons churches repeat mistakes is because institutional memory disappears kind of quickly. Leadership rotates, committee members change, conversations get forgotten, and eventually churches simply repeat the problems because nobody intentionally carried those lessons forward. So document what you're learning. Clarify the expectations. Define healthier systems. Record the lessons you learned from the heritage event or the reflection events that you may have, or the lessons you've learned from the unhealthy patterns that you've had with pastors. Build memory intentionally. What pattern keeps repeating in your church simply because nobody stopped long enough to address it honestly? You're not trapped by your church's past. Now, churches rarely drift into health accidentally. Healthy churches reflect honestly, learn clearly, respond differently, and that's how cycles finally begin to break. Thank you for spending a few moments with me today. If this episode was helpful, share it with another church leader that may be walking through transition or conflict. And make sure you subscribe to the Church Brain and receive the weekly briefing and the podcast. Remember, healthy churches don't just survive difficult seasons, they learn from them as well. See you later.